Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. We're continuing with chronology of the life of Christ. Now we come where the 12 return from their mission. It's only in two Gospels, Mark and Luke. It's very short. I will read them in that sequence. First, Mark 6:30 and 31. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and reported all to him, both what they had done and what they had taught. Because so many were coming and going that they did not even have leisure to eat, he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." That was Mark. Now I'll read Luke chapter 9 and just verse 10. When the apostles returned, they reported to him all that they had done. Then he took them and withdrew privately to a deserted place belonging to a town called Bethsaida. Now, this I have to talk about, unfortunately. Instead of a deserted place belonging to a town called Bethsaida, 0.5%, half of 1% of the Greek manuscripts of objectively inferior quality, I can prove that, have, quote, a town called Bethsaida, to be followed by NIV, NASB, Living Bible, TEV, etc. The problem is that the eclectic text currently in vogue, along with the modern versions that follow it, have Jesus and company going into the town of Bethsaida. But in verse 12, here in Luke 9, verse 12, the disciples say they are in a deserted area. Thus, a contradiction is introduced. The eclectic text, Greek text here is also at variance with itself in the parallel passages. It contradicts itself, okay? In Matthew 14:13, all texts have Jesus going to a deserted place. And in verse 15 of Matthew 14, the disciples say the place is deserted. Send the crowd away to the towns. And in Mark 6:31-32, all texts have Jesus going to a deserted place. And in verse 35 of Mark 6, the disciples say it is a deserted place, etc. A deserted place, etc. So, the eclectic text not only makes Luke contradicts himself, but sets him against Matthew and Mark, and that's on the basis of only half of 1% of the manuscripts. For a more detailed discussion, please see my article, Bethsaida or Tiberias. It's either in the appendix or in that new book, Controverted Topics. Now we can go on and talk about the feeding of the 5,000 men, that was. This is in all four Gospels, one of the few things that is commented on by all four Gospels. I will read them in the sequence: Luke, Matthew, Mark, and John. There's going to be a lot of repetition, but that's just the way it is. First, Luke chapter 9, verses 11 through 17. But the crowds, being aware, followed him, so he received them and started speaking to them about the kingdom of God, and he cured those who needed healing. Now, when the day began to decline, the 12 approached and said to him, "Dismiss the crowd so that they may go to the surrounding villages and their farms, lodge and find food, because we are in a deserted place here." But he said to them, "You feed them." So they said, "Oh, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd." Parenthesis, there were about 5,000 men, that's males. And he said to his disciples, "Make them recline in groups of 50. They did so, making them all recline. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the multitude. So they all ate and were filled, and 12 baskets of the pieces that they left were taken up. Let's comment on a few things here. Now, really, have you ever thought about it? Jesus says, "You feed them." With what, please? The only way the disciples could have obeyed this command would be by a miracle similar to what Jesus proceeded to perform. But of course, they'd never seen anything like that. They weren't up to it. And I asked, well, are we up to it? Probably not. we wouldn't have done any better. As I already intimated, it says 5,000 men. That was males. Later on, the women and children are added. Now, 12 baskets of pieces were taken up. The collecting was probably done by others, not just by the 12. And in any case, that leftover bread was used by other people. The disciples didn't take it. And of course, the baskets weren't theirs either, for that matter. Now let's go on to Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. A lot of repetition. Excuse me. Upon hearing it, Jesus departed from there by boat to a deserted place privately. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. So when Jesus disembarked, he saw a large crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, with evening coming on, his disciples approached him, saying, "The place is uninhabited, and the hour is already late. Dismiss the crowds, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them to eat." But they say to him, "Oh, we have nothing here except 5 loaves and 2 fish." So he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he commanded the crowds to recline on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, he blessed, and breaking the loaves, he gave to the disciples, and the disciples to the crowds. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up the fragments that remained, 12 baskets full. Now those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. A couple things here. Said a deserted place privately in verse 13. From Mark, we learn that Jesus and the disciples were under heavy pressure from the crowds, no time even to eat. So when Jesus heard of John's death, and under such ignominious circumstances, he wanted to get away so he could grieve and assimilate the news. That's my interpretation, anyway. When Jesus disembarked, there was a large crowd, and he had compassion on them. Mark's account, we'll get there next, makes it clear that the people ran along the shore and arrived first. Let's see if we can visualize what happened, the picture. There is a large bay between Capernaum and Tiberias, the mouth being about 10 miles wide. Just by the direction the boat was heading, many would have had a good idea of its destination. And without a good tailwind, and even more so if the disciples had to row, it was a large boat, right? People on the shore could easily have arrived before the boat, even covering a greater distance. Similar to a modern day marathon. People would have been spread out along several miles of shoreline, and any stragglers could have followed what was happening. The fastest runners stayed ahead of the boat, while the followers spread out behind, so that wherever the boat docked, there would be people standing and waiting. Those who had overtaken the boat would return, no problem. The slower ones kept arriving, swelling the crowd. In the end, there were 5,000 men plus women and children. Now, the crowd seemed to thwart Jesus' intention. He wanted to get away. But far from being angered, he had compassion on them. Like, inside a city, there wouldn't be room for so many people. 10 to 15,000? But out in the open, in a deserted place, And as the news spread, the crowd followed. Okay. Again, I see, Jesus says, you give them to eat. What with? Please. But notice, although Jesus had to take the initiative, the disciples did participate in the miracle. I'll talk about that in John. And see my article, Do Feed Them, like I said. I really talk it out there. Now here in verse 21, 5,000 men, besides women and children. Any large crowd is likely to have more women and children than men. I say there may have well been 15,000 people there. And they were filled. How much food does it take to fill 15,000 hungry people? They'd been there without lunch, all right? This was evening. But notice the care not to waste anything. The fragments had to be collected. Okay, let's go on to Mark. Mark gives us a good deal more detail. I'm going to divide it up into 3 paragraphs. First, Mark 6:32 through 34. So they went away in the boat by themselves to a deserted place. That's probably Peter's boat. But many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and arrived before them and came together to him. Well, upon disembarking, Jesus saw a large crowd and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now here, unfortunately, I have to talk about a textual problem. We have here we actually have an even split in the attestation. Half of the Greek manuscripts have them, and the other half have him. That's they recognize them or recognize him. But the best line of transmission that I'm translating has them. But no, think about it. If the fishing boat were going out to fish, there would not be 13 men in it, right? 2 or 3. Also, the boat was known, probably Peter's boat, and there was only one large group of men like that going around together. The people would not have to single out Jesus to know who they were. So I say that them is correct. Doesn't make any difference here. Another small problem, this one doesn't make much difference either. 4% of the Greek manuscripts omit and came together to him, to be followed by NIV, NASB, Living Bible, TV, etc. Okay. Again, well, first let's read now verses 35 through 38. I better read it first. When it was late in the day, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send them away so they may go to the surrounding farms and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But in reply, he said to them, "You feed them." And they say to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and feed them?" So he says to them, "Well, how many loaves do you have? Go and see." When they knew, they said, 5 and 2 fish. I just want to say one more word about this. The Lord says, "You feed them." Obviously, they had no way of expecting a response like that, which is humanly impossible, if not ridiculously impossible. However, in the end, the solution did pass through their hands. But unless Jesus was joking, which I don't want to think, Jesus was telling them to perform the miracle. But they had never seen anything like that done before. Well, they couldn't handle it, and neither could I. Now let's go on and read verses 39 through 44. This is from Mark. Then Jesus, directed them all to recline in groups on the green grass. So they reclined in plots of hundreds and fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to serve the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Well, they all ate and were filled. And they picked up 12 full baskets of broken pieces, also the fish. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. Just a couple things here. Again, the text is very clear. The people ate until they were full. It wasn't just a little something to tide them over. They stopped because they didn't want to eat anymore. Now, again, we have these large baskets, and they were probably borrowed from fishing boats nearby, which we'll get in parallel account, meaning John. And I say that maybe the owners got their baskets back with interest. Well, what happened to all that bread? The disciples didn't take it. So if they gave the baskets back, the bread went with the baskets. Okay. Now I'm going to read John. I'm going to break it up into 3 paragraphs as well. And this will bring this particular account to an end. Like I've said, this is the only one of the few places we have all 4 Gospels. It's John in chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias, and a huge crowd was following him because they had seen his signs that he kept performing on the sick. So Jesus went up on the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. Verse 4 in parentheses. A couple things here. From the parallel accounts, it appears that Jesus embarked at Capernaum. I'm in verse 1 here, chapter 6. Matthew informs us he had just heard the baptizer's death and so on. But from only here in John 6, well, in John verse 23, 6:20, we learn that the destination was near Tiberias. So the Galilee, that was also called the Lake of Tiberias from time to time. The point is that Capernaum and Tiberias are both on the same side, the western side of the Sea of Galilee. But there's a large bay between them, up to as much as 10 miles of water. Now, John says that he went up on the mountain. But comparing the accounts, I take it that they'd already spent quite a bit of time on the beach. The afternoon was wearing away. Since verse 6 says that he knew what he was going to do, I assume that it was a deliberate move that Jesus did to get the crowd up where there was grass, so they could sit down in relative comfort rather than on sand or gravel, as the beach could have been. Now, verse 4, I put within parentheses, the Passover was near. I confess that I just don't see the connection that this information has with the story. But it does give us a framework, a time frame. Since chapter 5 happened at Passover time, and this is chapter 6, there was an interval of a year between the two. Now I'll carry on with verses 5 through 9. I'm still in John 6. Then raising his eyes and observing that a huge crowd was coming toward him, Jesus says to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread so that these folks may eat?" Now he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was about to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for them, so that each of them could receive a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, says to him, Jesus, "There is a little boy here who has 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 small fish. But what are they for so many?" Then Jesus said, "Make the people recline." Now there was plenty of grass in the place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples sorry, I'm going to keep on reading, but I should have stopped there. Sorry about this. I'm going to keep on reading now. He distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to those who were reclining. So too with the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were full, he says to his disciples, collect the leftover fragments, let nothing be wasted. So they collected and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that were left over from those who had eaten. Now then, having seen the miraculous sign that Jesus performed, the man said, this one really is the prophet who has come into the world. I'll talk about that next video. I'm sorry, I should have stopped after verse 9, but let's go back now to verse 5. Here, Jesus says to Philip, where are we going to find bread? According to the other 3 accounts, the disciples had already suggested to Jesus that he send the people away to the surrounding towns to buy food. But let's stop and just think. How many bread stores would a village have, and how much bread would a store still have on hand at 5 p.m.? If they could have gone to every store within a radius of 30 miles, I doubt that they would have found even 10,000 loaves available. There were more people than that. And I take it that the Lord's question shows that their suggestion was really a cop-out. I didn't know what to do. I wouldn't have known either. And then Philip says, well, 2,000 denarii, that's the wages for 200 days of manual labor. So how much bread could you buy with that, do you suppose? Probably an awful lot of it. But the crowd was so huge that Philip figured that even that probably wouldn't do it. If a day's wage would buy 50 small loaves, for instance, that would make it 10,000 loaves, and there'd be more people than bread, probably. Anyway, it wasn't easy. Now let's look at this boy here. Verse 9, only John tells us about the little boy. That was his lunch. I think we have to understand that the boy handed his lunch over willingly. They didn't forcibly take it away from him. Therefore, the boy participated in the miracle. So we too, we have to give to God willingly. And when we give to God willingly, we too participate in the results of what God does with what we give him. Isn't that nice? Now here, only here, of the 4 accounts, perhaps 3% of the Greek manuscripts of inferior quality omit the reference to the disciples here and have Jesus distributing directly to the crowd himself. Said he distributed to the disciples, that's omitted. And you know what the modern versions do. Okay. That, of course, makes John contradict the other 3 Gospels. And of course, Jesus himself wasn't going to give the bread to 15,000 people. Come on. Oh, well. Now, you might think that, if Jesus could produce bread like that, but Jesus says you can't waste anything. Everything has to be collected. Our reaction would be, okay, easy come, easy go. As I've already said, the disciples probably had help collecting the fragments. Verse 14, these guys that say he's the prophet, that's the prophet in Deuteronomy. I'm going to talk about that in the next video. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. I have that article that really goes into this, but when Jesus multiplied, it didn't become a mountain of bread and fish. The disciples had just what they had in their hands. That was all. Just think you're one of those disciples, and you have to take care of 1,000 people, and all you have is a bread and fish. Wouldn't you feel just a little bit ridiculous? But they advanced and handed the first, and it didn't quit. It just kept multiplying. And I take it the people themselves kept handing it on. It just kept multiplying as they handed it on. Would have been fun to watch. Well, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching, and God bless.